They laughed before she even reached the gate. A teenage girl, dust on her boots, hat slightly too big, gloves that had clearly seen better days. And behind her, a stallion no one on that ranch had been able to ride. The men leaned on the fence, smirking. Some didn't even try to hide it. She won't last 8 seconds. But here's what they didn't see. They didn't see the early mornings, the quiet hours in the barn, the way the horse's ears flicked toward her voice instead of away from it. They didn't see the way she wasn't trying to conquer the animal. She was trying to understand him. And when that gate swung open, something shifted, not just in the arena, in the ranch owner's eyes, because sometimes the loudest laugh in the crowd is just seconds away from turning into stunned silence. And what happened next? Well, that's the part no one expected. If you love real Western grit, unexpected comebacks, and stories that remind us why the frontier spirit still matters, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Horseback Legends Western Stories. Share this with someone who believes underdogs don't stand a chance. Because today, that belief is about to get tested. The sun hadn't even reached its highest point, and already the air over Miller Ranch shimmered with heat. Dust rolled in slow circles across the arena floor, kicked up by boots, hooves, and the restless shifting of a crowd that smelled entertainment. They had gathered for one reason, to watch another rider fail. The center of all that attention stood a narrow-shouldered teenage girl. Adjusting the strap of her glove like this was just another chore on a long list. Her name was Ellie Carter, 16 years old, barely tall enough to see clearly over the arena gate without rising onto her toes. And yet there she was. Someone near the fence snorted. "That kid's lighter than the saddle." A few men laughed, not cruel exactly, just confident, certain, like they already knew the ending. Ellie didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes or shoot back a sharp reply. She simply rested one hand on the wooden gate and looked toward the holding pen. That's where he was. Midnight, the stallion. No one had managed to ride clean. Coal-black coat, muscles like coiled wire, eyes sharp and alert, as if he understood every whisper in the stands. He wasn't just strong, he was proud. And pride can be harder to handle than power. 3 grown riders had tried in the last 2 weeks. One lasted 5 seconds. Another didn't make it to 3. The last walked away limping and swearing. He'd never mount that horse again. So when Ellie stepped forward and signed her name on the board, it didn't spark fear. It sparked amusement. Across the arena, leaning against the rail with arms crossed tight against his chest, stood Thomas Miller, the ranch owner. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't exactly encouraging her either. He had built this ranch from nothing but borrowed land and stubborn will. Every horse here meant something. Every failure cost something. And midnight? Midnight was becoming expensive. A ranch hand walked up beside him. "You really gonna let her try?" Thomas kept his eyes on Ellie. She asked, "That don't mean she should." A pause. "She's been coming here every morning," Thomas said quietly. Before sunrise, the ranch hand blinked. "Doing what?" "Talking to him." Now that earned a real laugh. "Talking?" Thomas didn't answer, because he had seen it. From his kitchen window, before the rest of the ranch stirred awake, a slim silhouette by the stall door. No saddle, no rope, just soft words in the dark. And midnight hadn't charged the gate. He hadn't snapped at the bars. He had listened back in the arena. Ellie rolled her shoulders once, loosening the tension. Her boots pressed into the dirt, as if she was memorizing its feel. Some riders stomped before a challenge. Others paced. She stood still. A few teenage boys in the crowd nudged each other. "Bet she cries before she hits the ground. Bet she don't even get on." Their laughter rippled outward, catching like wildfire. Ellie finally turned toward the sound. Not angry, not embarrassed, just calm. And that calmness, it unsettled a few people more than tears ever could. You ever notice how confidence doesn't always look loud? Sometimes it looks like silence. The gate to the holding pen rattled as midnight shifted. A low, restless snort cut through the chatter. Heads turned instantly. Now that was something worth watching. The ranch hands moved carefully, guiding the stallion toward the chute. Even restrained, he radiated force. His muscles rolled beneath his coat like something alive and electric. Ellie walked toward him without hesitation. That's when the laughter softened. Not gone Dot, just uncertain Dot. She didn't rush, didn't reach out immediately. She stopped just outside his space and let him notice her. Midnight's ears flicked back, then forward. A moment passed, dust drifting between them like suspended time. Ellie spoke, too low for the crowd to hear, but Midnight heard. His head lowered, just slightly. Not submission. Not defeat. Recognition. A murmur spread along the fence. Did you see that? Probably coincidence. Yeah. Wait till he starts bucking. Thomas Miller shifted his weight. His jaw tightened. He wasn't rooting for her, but he wasn't dismissing her either. Because there was something about the way she moved around that horse. No jerky motions. No forced dominance. No desperate bravado. Just patience. She reached for the saddle. The leather creaked as she lifted it. It looked heavier than she did. One of the ranch hands stepped forward, maybe out of reflex to help. She shook her head gently. I've got it. The words weren't loud, but they carried. The saddle landed square, clean, balanced. Midnight stamped once, testing. Ellie adjusted the cinch with steady fingers. Not rushed, not shaky. You could feel the shift now. The energy in the crowd had changed. The laughter was thinning. Curiosity was replacing it. Thomas leaned forward against the rail, because this wasn't going the way it usually did. Most riders came in full of ego. They slapped the horse, tightened straps hard, climbed up fast like speed alone could overpower resistance. Ellie waited. She placed her forehead briefly against Midnight's neck. The arena went quieter than anyone expected. Even the wind seemed to pause. What was she doing? Praying? Apologizing? Promising? No one could hear. But Midnight exhaled. Long, slow. And in that breath, something invisible shifted. Ellie stepped into the stirrup. A few men straightened up instantly. Here it comes. She swung up smooth, not flashy, not dramatic, just controlled. Like she had mounted this horse 100 times in her mind before, daring to do it in real life. Midnight tensed. The air tightened. You could almost hear the crowd thinking the same thing. Now she's done. His back arched slightly beneath her weight. Muscles coiled. Energy building. Ellie didn't grip with panic. The settled. Centered. Balanced. Her free hand hovered steady in the air. Thomas felt his pulse thud. Once in his throat. Because for the first time since Midnight arrived at his ranch, the horse wasn't fighting the rider. Not yet. And the crowd? They weren't laughing anymore. They were waiting. And sometimes, waiting is louder than mockery ever was. Before Ellie Carter ever stepped into that arena, Midnight already had a reputation. Not the kind that spreads through newspapers or shiny rodeo posters. The kind that spreads through whispers. He threw Dawson clean over the rail, broke Jenkins' wrist, nearly flipped on top of Ramirez. Stories like that grow fast on a ranch, faster than weeds after summer rain. And the more they're told, the bigger the horse becomes in people's minds. But Midnight hadn't always been a problem. Thomas Miller remembered the first day the trailer door opened. The stallion stepped out slow, measured, his coat almost blue-black under the sun. Not wild-eyed, not crazed, just alert, like he was reading the world instead of reacting to it. Thomas had seen hundreds of horses in his life. Draft horses, barrel racers, old ranch geldings that could work from sunrise to moonlight. But Midnight was different. He wasn't scared. He wasn't aggressive. He was independent. And independence doesn't always mix well with pride. The breeder who sold him didn't use the word dangerous. He used a softer word, untamed. Thomas should have paid closer attention to that tone. The first rider to test Midnight was Caleb Dawson. Broad shoulders, confident grin. The kind of man who cracked his knuckles before mounting like it was a bar fight, not a partnership. Caleb didn't waste time building trust. He tightened the cinch hard, slapped Midnight's flank, climbed up fast. For 3 seconds, it looked smooth. Then Midnight exploded. Not wild thrashing, not blind panic. Precision. He twisted, dipped, and launched his back legs high with controlled force. Caleb hit the dirt so hard it knocked the air from his lungs. The crowd gasped, then laughed. Bad luck, just needs firmer hands. Caleb tried again the next day. And left with a bruised ego and a cracked rib. After that, it became personal. 2 more experienced riders stepped in over the following weeks. Men who had broken colts half their lives. Men who believed there wasn't a horse alive they couldn't fix. They approached Midnight the same way. Pressure, dominance, force. And every single time, Midnight answered with resistance. Not chaos. Resistance. That was what bothered Thomas the most. This wasn't a horse acting out from fear. Midnight never tried to bite, never kicked in the stall, never showed signs of madness. He simply refused to accept being overpowered. Thomas began to feel something he didn't like. Embarrassment. Other ranch owners heard about it. Some offered advice. Some offered smirks disguised as sympathy. Maybe he's too much horse for you. Miller. That one stung. So Thomas doubled down. More training sessions. Different bits. Tighter reins. Nothing worked. The harder they pushed, the harder Midnight pushed back. Until finally, Thomas did something unexpected. He stopped trying. Not because he gave up, but because something about the stallion's eyes made him pause. One evening, long after the ranch hands clocked out, Thomas walked to Midnight's stall alone. No rope, no saddle. Just silence. The stallion looked up from his hay, calm, watchful. Thomas leaned against the wooden rail. "You're not mean," he muttered. Midnight's ears twitched. "You just don't trust." It was the first time Thomas had said that out loud. And saying it felt like admitting something about himself. 2. Because Thomas Miller built his ranch on control, on structure, on discipline. That's how you survive harsh winters and thin profit margins. But control doesn't build trust. That realization sat heavy in his chest. Then came the mornings. At first, Thomas thought he imagined it. A shadow moving near the barn before sunrise. But the 3rd day in a row, he stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched clearly. Ellie Carter. Small frame, oversized flannel shirt, hair tied back low. Standing outside Midnight's stall, not touching him, just talking. Thomas couldn't hear the words, but he saw the difference. Midnight didn't pace when she was there, didn't pin his ears back. He stood still, listening. One morning, Ellie held out her hand, palm open. Midnight stepped forward on his own. No halter, no rope. Thomas nearly spilled his coffee. He told himself it didn't mean anything. Maybe the horse was just curious. Maybe he was tired. But curiosity doesn't lower a stallion's guard like that. Trust does. And trust takes time. Ellie kept coming. Every morning. Rain once, wind another day. She never missed. The ranch hands noticed eventually. Kids wasting her time. Thomas didn't correct them. He wanted to see how far it would go. 1 week passed, then another. Ellie never asked to ride him. Not once, until she did. He was testing, each movement sharper than the last, each twist calculated. He dipped his shoulder and kicked hard again, trying to snap her forward over his neck. Ellie shifted back just enough to stay centered. Her free hand cut clean through the air, steady as a compass needle. 5 seconds. A murmur replaced laughter now. Thomas Miller leaned so far over the fence, his knuckles whitened. He had seen this horse move before, seen the precision, the pride, but he had never seen him hesitate mid-buck. And that's what just happened. For half a heartbeat, Midnight's back didn't arch. He landed square, almost balanced, as if he were waiting for her to lose her seat. She didn't. 6 seconds. Dust coated Ellie's jeans. Her hat had tilted slightly, but stayed on. Her braid swung behind her like a dark ribbon in the wind. Midnight surged again, launching into a sideways leap that would have snapped a less prepared rider clean off. Ellie tightened her legs, not crushing, not forcing, just anchoring. Her eyes stayed forward, not squeezed shut, not wide with fear, focused. You ever notice how animals can sense when someone's afraid? They don't read words, they read tension. Midnight bucked again, hard, 7 seconds. The arena had gone strangely quiet now. Even the teenage boys who had been betting on her fall were silent. Because something was happening they didn't understand. Midnight wasn't escalating. He wasn't panicking. He was adjusting. His jumps grew less explosive. Still powerful, but less frantic. The sharp twists softened into straighter bursts of speed. And then 8 seconds. In rodeo terms, that's the mark. That's survival. But Ellie didn't slide off. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She stayed seated, and Midnight slowed. Not immediately, but gradually. The wild vertical leaps turned into heavy strides. His breathing deepened. His head tossed once, twice. Then he stopped bucking. Completely. The silence that followed was heavier than any cheer. Midnight stood in the center of the arena, sides heaving, dust rising around him in slow spirals. Ellie sat upright, still, balanced, alive to every movement beneath her. No rope yanked tight, no reins pulled harshly, just her hand resting steady near his neck. The crowd didn't know what to do. Applaud? Shout? Call it a fluke? Because this wasn't how it was supposed to end. Midnight had never stopped on his own before. He had always fought until the rider hit dirt. Thomas felt his pulse in his ears. He wasn't watching Ellie now. He was watching Midnight. The stallion's head lowered slightly, just slightly. Not submission, not defeat. Something else. Recognition. Ellie leaned forward, her voice low enough that only the horse could hear. It's okay. No one else caught the words. But Midnight did. His ears relaxed. The tension in his shoulders eased like a rope finally loosened. The ranch hand stood frozen near the open gate, unsure whether to move. 10 seconds passed, then 15. Still mounted, still steady. Finally, Ellie did something no one expected. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't circle the arena to show control. She gently guided Midnight toward the center, and dismounted, clean, smooth. Her boots hit the dirt softly. Midnight didn't bolt, didn't rear. He stood there, beside her. The crowd erupted then, but not with laughter, with disbelief, with scattered cheers that built into something louder. One of the ranch hands let out a whistle low and long. Did you see that? Thomas didn't answer, because he was walking toward them. Step by deliberate step, dust clung to his jeans. His boots pressed deep into the arena floor. Ellie stood next to Midnight with one hand resting lightly against his shoulder. Not gripping, not claiming, just present. Midnight's breathing slowed under her touch. Thomas stopped a few feet away. He looked at the horse first, then at the girl. You didn't break him, he said quietly. Ellie met his gaze. No, sir. A beat passed. I didn't try to. The wind swept across the arena again, lifting loose dust into the air like a curtain rising after a performance. Thomas studied Midnight's posture, relaxed, alert, not agitated, not resentful. He had spent weeks trying to force obedience out of that stallion. And in 8 seconds, no, in weeks of quiet mornings before that, this girl had done something entirely different. She had earned it. The crowd pressed closer to the fence now, faces no longer smug. Some looked impressed. Some looked unsettled. Because watching strength overcome strength is familiar. Watching patience overcome pride? That's rarer. Thomas finally spoke louder. Enough for the arena to hear. Well, he cleared his throat. Looks like Midnight just found his rider. And in that moment, the laughter that once filled the arena felt like it belonged to a different day. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was something far harder to measure trust. In trust, once given, changes everything. The cheering didn't fade quickly. It rolled across the arena like thunder chasing itself. Boots stomping against wooden planks, hands clapping, voices calling Ellie's name like they'd supported her all along. Funny how fast a crowd can switch sides. But Thomas Miller wasn't listening to the applause. He was watching Midnight. The stallion stood beside Ellie as if the chaos around him didn't matter. No whites flashing in his eyes. No tension coiling in his neck. Just steady breathing and the occasional flick of his tail against the dust. Thomas had owned that horse for 6 months. 6 months of effort. 6 months of frustration. 6 months of pride, swallowing and second-guessing. And now here he was, staring at something he hadn't been able to create. Calm, not forced, earned. Just observation. Thomas let that settle. He thought back to the early training days, the tightened straps, the sharp commands, the visible frustration when Midnight resisted. He hadn't seen himself as aggressive. He'd seen himself as firm. But firm and force can blur when pride gets involved. The ranch hands were gathering closer now, curiosity pulling them in like gravity. One of them spoke up. You saying we've been doing it wrong? Ellie shook her head. No, sir. I'm saying maybe he wasn't ready for how you were doing it. The difference was subtle, but important. Thomas felt the weight of every decision he'd made regarding that horse. Not regret, reflection. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of hay and sun-baked wood across the arena. The crowd was slowly dispersing now, but many lingered, watching the quiet exchange between ranch owner and teenage rider, because this part mattered too. Not just the ride, the meaning behind it. Thomas removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. He rarely did that in front of others. It felt oddly symbolic. You've been coming before sunrise, he said. Ellie nodded. Why? A faint smile touched her lips. That's when it's quiet enough to hear him. Thomas almost laughed at that, not mockingly, but in disbelief at how simple she made it sound. Hear him. As if horses spoke in plain sentences. But maybe they did, just not in ways he'd been listening for. Midnight shifted closer to Ellie, his shoulder brushing lightly against her arm. It wasn't dramatic. It was natural. And that might have been the most shocking part of all. Thomas stepped back, giving them space. You planning on riding him again? He asked. Ellie looked up at him. Only if he lets me. The ranch hands chuckled at that, but softer this time. Less skepticism, more respect. Thomas studied the horse one last time. Midnight wasn't a project anymore. He wasn't an embarrassment. He wasn't even a challenge. He was potential. And maybe, just maybe, he had found the right partner. Thomas turned toward the remaining crowd near the rail. I don't want anyone working Midnight without her from now on, he announced. That caused a stir. You serious? Someone asked. Dead serious. He looked back at Ellie. You earned that. Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, sir. No gloating. No grin. Just responsibility settling onto young shoulders. Thomas felt a strange mix of pride and humility wash over him. He had built this ranch believing strength meant control. But what he had just witnessed taught him something different. Strength could also mean restraint, patience, listening. As the arena slowly emptied, Thomas lingered behind, watching Ellie lead Midnight toward the barn. No rope pulled tight. Just a loose rein and steady steps. The stallion followed willingly, Not broken, not beaten, but bonded. Thomas exhaled slowly. The laughter from earlier that day felt distant now. Small. Unimportant, because what he saw wasn't just a teenage girl riding a difficult horse. He saw the future of his ranch walking across that dust. And for the first time in months, he wasn't worried about midnight anymore. He was impressed by sunset. The story had already grown legs. It moved past the arena fences, past the barns, past the windmill that creaked at the edge of Miller Ranch. By dinner time, folks in town were repeating it over coffee and pie. The girl rode him clean. No, she didn't just ride him. She calmed him. Thomas Miller gave her the reins. Every retelling carried a little more awe. But back at the ranch, the dust had settled. The arena sat quiet, glowing gold under the lowering sun. What had felt like a storm just hours earlier now felt almost peaceful. Ellie stood by the fence alone, hat resting against her chest, watching midnight graze in the outer pasture. No saddle, no audience, just open land and a horse moving freely. You'd expect celebration, wouldn't you? A victory lap, a proud grin that wouldn't fade. But Ellie's expression wasn't triumphant. It was thoughtful, because deep down, she knew something most people didn't. The ride wasn't the victory. The trust was. Footsteps crunched behind her. Thomas Miller approached slowly, hands resting on his belt. He didn't speak right away. He followed her gaze out to the pasture. Thomas stopped a few feet away. He looked at the horse first, then at the girl. "You didn't break him," he said quietly. Ellie met his gaze. "No, sir. A beat passed. I didn't try to." The wind swept across the arena again, lifting loose dust into the air like a curtain rising after a performance. Thomas studied Midnight's posture, relaxed, alert, not agitated, not resentful. He had spent weeks trying to force obedience out of that stallion. And in 8 seconds, no, in weeks of quiet mornings before that, this girl had done something entirely different. She had earned it. The crowd pressed closer to the fence now, faces no longer smug. Some looked impressed. Some looked unsettled. Because watching strength overcome strength is familiar. Watching patience overcome pride, that's rarer. Thomas finally spoke louder, enough for the arena to hear. "Well," he cleared his throat. "Looks like Midnight just found his rider." And in that moment, the laughter that once filled the arena felt like it belonged to a different day. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was something far harder to measure trust. In trust, once given, changes everything. The cheering didn't fade quickly. It rolled across the arena like thunder chasing itself. Boots stomping against wooden planks, hands clapping, voices calling Ellie's name like they'd supported her all along. Funny how fast a crowd can switch sides. But Thomas Miller wasn't listening to the applause. He was watching Midnight. The stallion stood beside Ellie as if the chaos around him didn't matter. No whites flashing in his eyes. No tension coiling in his neck. Just steady breathing and the occasional flick of his tail against the dust. Thomas had owned that horse for 6 months. 6 months of effort. 6 months of frustration. 6 months of pride, swallowing and second-guessing. And now here he was, staring at something he hadn't been able to create. Calm, not forced, earned. The stallion followed willingly, not broken, not beaten, but bonded. Thomas exhaled slowly. The laughter from earlier that day felt distant now. Small. Unimportant, because what he saw wasn't just a teenage girl riding a difficult horse. He saw the future of his ranch walking across that dust. And for the first time in months, he wasn't worried about midnight anymore. He was impressed by sunset. The story had already grown legs. It moved past the arena fences, past the barns, past the windmill that creaked at the edge of Miller Ranch. By dinner time, folks in town were repeating it over coffee and pie. The girl rode him clean. No, she didn't just ride him. She calmed him. Thomas Miller gave her the reins. Every retelling carried a little more awe. But back at the ranch, the dust had settled. The arena sat quiet, glowing gold under the lowering sun. What had felt like a storm just hours earlier now felt almost peaceful. Ellie stood by the fence alone, hat resting against her chest, watching midnight graze in the outer pasture. No saddle, no audience, just open land and a horse moving freely. You'd expect celebration, wouldn't you? A victory lap, a proud grin that wouldn't fade. But Ellie's expression wasn't triumphant. It was thoughtful, because deep down, she knew something most people didn't. The ride wasn't the victory. The trust was. Footsteps crunched behind her. Thomas Miller approached slowly, hands resting on his belt. He didn't speak right away. He followed her gaze out to the pasture. Word spread fast in small towns. By the next week, folks were driving out just to catch a glimpse of midnight in the pasture. Some came hoping to see another dramatic ride. But what they found instead was something quieter. Ellie brushing him in the barn. Midnight lowering his head without resistance. Training sessions that looked more like conversations than contests. And slowly, something else changed too. The ranch hands began adjusting their approach with the other horses. Less force, more patience. They started noticing things, small shifts in ears, breathing patterns, tension in muscles, details they'd overlooked before. Thomas noticed it all. The ranch felt different, lighter, stronger in a way that didn't rely on intimidation. One evening, as the sun dipped low again, Thomas stood alone by the arena fence. He looked down at the dirt where the crowd had once laughed. The same dust, the same fence, but a different understanding. Strength wasn't about breaking something until it bent to your will. It was about standing steady enough for trust to grow. Behind him, he heard hoofbeats. Ellie and Midnight moved across the open field, smooth and connected, like they'd been partners for years. No crowd, no challenge, just rhythm. Thomas adjusted his hat and allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. Because legends aren't always born in chaos. Sometimes they're born in silence, in early mornings, in patient hands, in moments no one else thinks are worth watching. The crowd had laughed. Seconds later, they had stood in shock. But the real story? It wasn't about 8 seconds in an arena. It was about what happens when someone chooses understanding over ego. And on Miller Ranch, that lesson would last far longer than the dust ever did. Midnight lifted his head briefly, ears forward, then lowered it again to graze. "He's calmer," Thomas said quietly. Ellie nodded. "He feels different." Thomas glanced at her. "Different how?" She considered the question carefully. "Like he's not waiting for someone to challenge him." Thomas let that settle in. He'd spent months seeing Midnight as a test of authority, a benchmark of skill, a reputation at stake. But standing there now, watching the stallion move freely across the field, he saw something else. Relief, not just in the horse, in himself. "You know," Thomas said slowly, "I almost sold him last month." Ellie turned, surprised. "Why?" "Figured he was more trouble than he was worth." Midnight flicked his tail in the distance, catching the last streaks of sunlight along his coat. "He's worth more than money," Ellie said softly. Thomas didn't argue. He had built his life measuring value in cattle numbers, harvest yields, strong fences. But some things couldn't be tallied. The sound of boots echoed as a few ranch hands walked past the arena, nodding respectfully toward Ellie, not teasing, not doubting. Respect. It's a quiet thing when it's real. One of the younger ranch boys, the same one who had laughed earlier that day, slowed his steps. "Hey," he called awkwardly. "Nice ride?" Ellie smiled lightly. "Thanks." He hesitated, then added, "I didn't think you'd last." "I know," she replied, not unkindly. He scratched the back of his neck. Guess I was wrong. Thomas watched the exchange closely. There was no gloating in Ellie's posture. No, I told you so. Just acceptance, because proving people wrong is loud. But earning their respect? That's steady. As the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, Thomas made a decision. Tomorrow, he said, we start fresh. Ellie tilted her head. With midnight? With the whole ranch. He leaned against the fence beside her. I've been running this place the same way for years. Firm, structured, efficient. He exhaled slowly. But maybe there's room for listening, too. Ellie didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the pasture grass, like a quiet agreement. You built something strong, she said finally. Thomas gave a small smile. Maybe it's time to build something wiser. In the distance, Midnight began trotting lightly along the fence line, not restless, not anxious, just moving for the joy of it. Ellie watched him, her eyes bright in the fading light. Will you ride him again? Thomas asked. She nodded. If he wants me to. Thomas chuckled softly. You really believe that matters, don't you? I know it does. A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full. You ever realize how quickly a moment can change how people see you? That morning, Ellie Carter had been the punchline. By evening, she was the standard. Not because she overpowered a stallion, but because she refused to treat him like an enemy.